Tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern over on Jaguar Gator 8, a new college football video drops. Click the card in the upper right corner to go to the channel. Also, join me tomorrow night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern for a very special edition of NFL Draft Trivia, where you'll have a chance to test your knowledge of the draft for a chance to win cash prizes. Link to play below. And now, on with our feature presentation. When you think of old NFL draft picks, odds are the first name that comes to mind is this man right here, and rightfully so. This is Oklahoma State quarterback Brandon Weeden, who was chosen by the Cleveland Browns with the 22nd pick in the first round of the 2012 NFL Draft. This pick was universally panned. I think literally everyone besides the Browns knew that this pick was not going to work out. Usually, anytime there's a massive bust in the first round, there are a group of people who are shocked by the player busting. People were stunned that Josh Rosen busted. People were stunned that Jamarcus Russell didn't work out. And people were stunned that Tony Mandrich didn't work out, just to name a few. However, I don't know a single person who was thrown off guard by the fact that Weeden did nothing of note in the NFL. Everyone laughed at the pick, and when he failed, the consensus was, well, what did you think was going to happen? And part of the reason why everyone thought this pick was terrible, and why I haven't seen a single person able to defend this selection, was because of his age. Weeden was old. At the time of the draft, he was 28 years old. For some perspective, at the time of the 2012 NFL Draft, Aaron Rodgers, who was drafted in 2005 and had a Super Bowl win, a Super Bowl MVP, and an MVP season, and was coming off of an unbelievable 2011 campaign where he threw 45 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, putting together one of the greatest years by any quarterback in NFL history, was the same age. In fact, he was 2 months younger than Weeden was. The Browns legitimately thought that it would be a good idea to draft a guy who, before his rookie season was over, would be 29 years old, and in the best case scenario, wouldn't finish his first contract until his mid-30s. Safe to say, this pick did not work out. But what you might not know is that there was a guy that, technically, was older than Weeden that got drafted. Much older. And by much older, I mean 4 years older, to the point where, in the best case scenario, he wouldn't be able to play in the NFL until he was 32 years old. And to make matters even crazier, this person was a running back, as in the position where most players are useless once they cross the age of 30, and the position with, hands down, the worst longevity of any position in football. Well, as absurd as this sounds, in 1972, Washington spent their first pick in the draft on a running back who wouldn't be able to join the team until he was 32. And no one, not even the player who got drafted, knew what the heck they were doing. This is the forgotten story behind the man who technically holds the crown for the oldest player to ever be drafted in NFL history. Before I talk about the player in question, we need some context to understand the man running Washington back then, because it will help to explain a lot. This is George Allen, and aside from being a great coach who was named the AP Coach of the Year twice, who successfully turned 2 franchises around, who never had a losing record in his 12 seasons as a head coach and won over 71% of his games, and is currently in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, he's best known for his rather unique way of running the team. If you think the Rams' current strategy of trading away first-round picks for established veterans is crazy, that is child's play compared to what George Allen was doing in Washington. He treated draft picks like they were a game of hot potato, because if he had a draft pick, he made it his mission to get rid of it. For some perspective, Allen coached Washington for 7 seasons from 1971 to 77. In those 7 seasons, he made a grand total of 0 first-round picks. Now, while this strategy might seem absurd today, back in the 70s, George Allen was somewhat of a genius with this. There was no salary cap, so teams could spend whatever the heck they wanted to on players. And in Allen's mind, if there was no cap, and you're trying to win games, especially at a time where only 4 teams in each conference made it to the postseason, and where the Dallas Cowboys, who were in your division, seemingly had one spot on lockdown every year under the guidance of Tom Landry, then why are you trying to develop rookies? Trade the picks on unproven guys for proven guys who have shown that they can play at this level, and keep doing that. And if there was a player that hypothetically you could have drafted if you kept the pick, you could always trade another pick to get that player, and the cycle continues. Allen was incredibly innovative in this regard, and while this strategy would be impossible today at the level that he did it at because of the salary cap and because of free agency, around the time of this story, it was absolutely brilliant. And based on how often Washington won under him, it clearly worked. But in 1972, Allen took this to an even crazier level than previous years. Because at least in 1971, Allen had a second-round pick, although this pick was a complete waste, as it was used on a wide receiver who played a grand total of 0 games with the team and scored just 5 touchdowns in his career. In 1972, Allen wanted as little picks as possible. The NFL draft was like a round of golf to him. The lower the number, the better. He traded his first-round pick to the New York Jets in exchange for 3-time AFL All-Star defensive end Verlin Biggs, which was a solid move, as Biggs had 32 sacks in his 4 seasons with Washington, including 15 sacks in 1973, which was 4th in the NFL. He traded his second-round pick to the Baltimore Colts in exchange for linebacker Bob Grant, which didn't work out, as Grant never started a game for the team and played just 1 season in the nation's capital. And he traded his 3rd round, 4th round, 5th round, 6th round, and 7th round picks to the Los Angeles Rams as part of a mega trade, where Allen basically reacquired his entire old team and got 6 players in exchange for 7 picks over the course of the 1971 and 1972 drafts. If you're doing the math at home, this means that Washington was not set to pick in 1972 until the 8th round, as the first time they'd be on the clock was with pick number 203. For some perspective, imagine if at the 2021 NFL Draft, you just slept through the entire thing, right up until the moment where the Buffalo Bills drafted Houston wide receiver Marquez Stevenson. Essentially, that's what Washington was doing here. And don't get it twisted, Allen was trying his absolute hardest to trade away that 8th round pick. If Allen could have gone that entire 17-round draft without taking a single player, he would have done so in a heartbeat. During the 7th round, Allen was working the phones, trying to see if any team would want the 8th round pick. He called up the Philadelphia Eagles. No deal was reached. He called up the New York Giants. No deal was reached. And he called several other teams, although we have no idea who the conversations were with or what the possible trade talks were. Allen was unsuccessful in his efforts. With that, he had to do what no man should ever have to do in his life. He actually had to make a draft pick. And if he couldn't trade his pick for a veteran, he was going to use that pick to draft one himself. And he had just the player in mind. To continue this story, we have to go north of the border and go to French Canada, because it's time to talk about the Montreal Alouettes. Entering the 1970 season, the situation in Montreal was incredibly dire. They hadn't won the Grey Cup since 1949, hadn't made it to the Grey Cup since 1956, and had missed the postseason in each of the past 3 seasons, which is an insanely long drought when you realize that 6 of the 9 teams in the league made it. They hadn't had a winning record since 1958, having gone over a decade out or below 500, and over the past 3 seasons, out of a possible 42 games, won just 7 of them. When you're winning 1 out of every 6 games, yeah, that's not good. However, in 1970, they stunned everyone by winning the Grey Cup. When you consider how putrid they had been for the past decade, this out-of-nowhere title might have been the most shocking title in Canadian football history. And perhaps the main reason for their success was the play of this man right here. This is running back Moses Denson, and after Denson dropped out of Maryland State following his sophomore season, he decided that he was going to try his luck out in Canada. And during that 1970 season, which was his first full season playing in Canada, he was an absolute stud. He had 820 rushing yards on 7.1 yards per carry, and combined with Dennis Duncan, who had 823 rushing yards, the 2 men combined to form a 2-headed monster on one of the greatest rushing attacks in the league. He was named an All-Star that year, had an additional 327 receiving yards, putting him above the 1,000-yard from scrimmage mark. In the 50th Grey Cup against the Calgary Stampeders, pulled off an incredible trick play, where somehow he threw a 10-yard touchdown pass after seemingly being stuffed in the backfield. The man was quick, the man was elusive and could bounce off of defenders with ease, and the man could change direction on a dime, thriving on the widened field that Canadian football provides. And even though he wasn't quite as good in 1971, as he only had 498 rushing yards on 5.1 yards per carry, since he missed 7 games with an injury, he caught the eye of George Allen. Washington didn't have the best rushing offense in 1971, as they finished 14th out of 26 teams in rushing yards, 21st in rushing touchdowns, and 20th in yards per attempt, meaning that they finished in the bottom half of the league in every major statistical rushing category. And in Allen's mind, a guy like Moses Denson, who proved himself in the CFL, at a time where the talent gap between the NFL and the CFL wasn't quite as large as it is today, could help the ball club out a lot. With that, Allen, being forced to actually make a draft pick, decided that he was going to take Moses Denson, and that Washington would own his draft rights. According to reports, when the pick was announced, team representatives who were gathered in New York for the draft gave a standing ovation. As absurd as it might seem to give a pick in the 8th round a standing ovation, considering how bored they must have been after spending 200 plus picks doing absolutely nothing, this is about the only story ending in the line and everybody clapped that I might actually believe. And Allen was thrilled about the pick, saying, "We went for experience instead of a rookie. He's by far the best player on our board by the time of our selection. He's a heck of a choice, and he wants to play for the Redskins." There's just one small problem. There's just one teeny tiny problem that we need to talk about with Denson. He was 32 years old. Now in actuality, he wasn't 32 years old, but in what seemed like the absolute best case scenario, the earliest he would be able to play for Washington was when he was 32. At the time of the draft, Denson was 28 years old, and he would turn 29 before the start of the 1972 season. However, he had 2 years left on his contract with the Alouettes, so tack on 2 more years to his age. That would mean that in 1972, when he was 29, and in 1973, when he was 30, he would be in Montreal. And on top of that, he had an option on his contract that would keep him there in 1974 as well, when he was 31. NFL teams honored CFL contracts, as the two leagues had a gentleman's agreement to not poach players away and create these bidding wars. God only knows after how the 1960s went with the American Football League, that was the last thing that the NFL wanted to do. This meant that the earliest he could join the NFL was in 1975, when he was 32 years old. That's right, George Allen drafted a 32-year-old rookie at running back. But you might be saying, well, you're speaking in hypotheticals here. Maybe Denson will try and buy his way out of the contract and cross the border to go back to the United States. Well, not quite. Because you see, Denson was on the phone with Washington Personnel Director Tim Temerill earlier in the week, and Denson basically told Temerill, "You're wasting your time if you draft me. I'm not leaving." As he said, "I kept telling him I had 2 more years and an option year on my contract here. I also said my wife and I like it just fine here in Montreal. After all, I've got a pretty good job with a finance firm." When I said all of that, Temerill told me he was sure they wouldn't draft me. But then, about 1:30 in the afternoon, I got a call from George Allen, and he said I'd been picked in the 8th round. I told him all about the contract stuff. I'm happy right here. So good job. Not only did you draft a guy that you wouldn't be able to get for another 3 years at the earliest, but you got a guy that didn't even necessarily want to come over. You know it's always a good sign when members of the press and journalists ask the public relations department of the team for information on the player, as just about everyone does. And the PR department for Washington responds by saying, "Let the press find out for themselves." I love that. The team you're covering just drafted a 28-year-old player who wouldn't be able to play until he was 32, and you ask the logical question of who he is. And the response is, figure it out. Almost as though Washington was basically asking the press to play Blue's Clues to learn more. And you know it's a good sign when Red O'Quinn, the general manager of the Alouettes, says following the pick, "At the moment, we have Moses under contract, and the Washington draft would appear to be a mistake. It looks like George Allen traded away his first 7 picks and then wasted his 8th. So let's suppose that Denson eventually crosses the border and plays for Washington when he's 32 years old. How many running backs are producing at that age? In 1971, there were 19 running backs to run for at least 700 yards. All of them were under the age of 30. There was no one even close to the age of 32. In 1970, there were 46 running backs to run for at least 350 yards. All of them were 30 years old or younger. Of the top 101 rushers in the NFL that year, and I say 101 instead of 100 because there was a 3-way tie for the final spot, the only one that was at least 32 years old was Bill Brown, who had 324 yards and no touchdowns on an abysmal 3.2 yards per carry. All of the evidence pointed to this pick by Washington being a complete waste. Drafting a player that was, in essence, a 32-year-old rookie at a position that is notorious for having short and unforgiving careers and is notorious for losing out to father time seemed like a boneheaded decision. On the surface, it seemed like you could have found a random person on the street to just throw a dart at a random name on your chalkboard, and it would have been a better and a wiser pick than Moses Denson. But the crazy part about this pick, to some extent, it actually worked. I'm not kidding. George Allen sort of knew what he was doing. Denson played 2 more seasons in Montreal, and was even named an All-Star in 1972. However, he did not play out his option, and he joined Washington in 1974. Yes, he was over the age of 30, making him an absurdly old rookie, but it was not the absolute worst-case scenario. as they got him 1 year earlier than originally expected. And even though he only played 2 seasons in Washington, he had 841 yards from scrimmage, started 17 games, scored 2 regular season touchdowns, and even had a touchdown in their 1974 divisional round playoff game against the Los Angeles Rams. Now you might be saying, wait a second, how was this a success? He played 2 years and scored 3 touchdowns. Well, this was an 8th round pick we were talking about. Of the 26 players taken in the 8th round that year, 15 of them never even played in the NFL, and another 3 of them only played in 1 game. Just by virtue of that, he was one of the most successful picks of that entire round. Furthermore, there were 14 players in the 8th round that year who were skill position players, so a running back or a wide receiver. Of those 14 guys, Denson was one of 2 who actually scored multiple touchdowns. Realistically speaking, for an 8th round pick, this was about what you could have hoped for. Absolutely crazy, but in a weird, bizarro way, this actually worked out. So what's the moral of the story? Even though I highly do not advise that you do this, as since the turn of the 21st century, I have never seen it work, sometimes age isn't everything. Sometimes age is just a number. Even if that number means that the player won't be able to join your team until he's in his 30s. Even if that number makes you look insanely stupid at the time of the draft, and makes everyone collectively scratch their heads in mass confusion. George Allen definitely did things differently, and perhaps no incident exemplified this more than the time he traded away his first 7 picks and then spent an 8th round pick on a guy that was essentially 32 years old and somehow made it work out. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.